Imagine attending your grandmother's funeral, saying your final goodbyes, only to discover years later that her body was secretly gutted, her bones and tissue stolen and sold for profit, all while you thought she was resting peacefully.
For over 1,000 families, this wasn't a nightmare. It was reality, orchestrated by a trusted medical professional who became one of America's most notorious body snatchers. Behind closed doors in funeral homes across New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, corpses were being systematically stripped of valuable body parts: bones, skin, heart valves, and tissue, taken without consent and with complete disregard for medical standards. The harvested parts were then sold to medical companies for dental implants, orthopedic procedures, and other surgical applications, generating millions in illicit profits. This is the true crime story of Dr. Michael Mastromarino, the doctor who turned from healing the living to harvesting the dead. What drove a medical professional to commit such violations? How did he manage to operate undetected for years? And what happened to the thousands of unsuspecting patients who received these illegally harvested tissues? Tonight, we'll uncover the full story of a medical professional who betrayed every oath he took, so make sure you stick to the end. Background: Michael Mastromarino was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1963. Growing up, he showed promise and intelligence, eventually pursuing a career in medicine, a path that would earn him respect and status in his community. After completing his education, Mastromarino established himself as a successful oral surgeon in Fort Lee, New Jersey, just across the bridge from Manhattan. His practice thrived throughout the 1990s. Colleagues described him as skilled and charismatic. Patients trusted him with their care. He had a beautiful family, a luxury home, and all the trappings of the American dream. But beneath the surface of success, Mastromarino was developing a severe addiction to painkiller medications. What began as occasional use spiraled into full-blown dependency, affecting his judgment and his ability to practice medicine safely. By 2000, his addiction had become impossible to hide. After being caught practicing while under the influence of narcotics, the New Jersey State Board of Dentistry revoked his medical license. Almost overnight, Mastromarino lost his practice, his reputation, and his primary source of income. The fall was swift and devastating. Divorced from his wife and unable to maintain his lifestyle, Mastromarino faced mounting debts and limited prospects. His medical career was over, but his knowledge of anatomy and surgical techniques remained, knowledge that would soon be repurposed for a far more sinister enterprise. Desperate for money and fueled by addiction, Mastromarino began searching for ways to leverage his medical expertise outside traditional practice. It was during this low point that he identified a lucrative opportunity in the growing tissue transplant industry, an industry with high demand, significant profits, and, as he would soon exploit, inadequate oversight. By 2001, the former respected oral surgeon had transformed himself into something else entirely, the mastermind of what would become one of the most shocking and widespread body-snatching operations in modern history. Operation begins. In 2001, Michael Mastromarino founded Biomedical Tissue Services, or BTS. On paper, it was a legitimate tissue recovery firm, a company that would harvest tissues from donors for use in medical procedures. In reality, it was the vehicle for a gruesome criminal enterprise. Mastromarino needed access to bodies, and for that, he needed allies in the funeral industry. He approached several funeral directors, primarily in the New York metropolitan area, with a proposition: allow him access to the bodies in their care, and he would pay them up to $1,000 per corpse. For struggling funeral homes, this offered a way to supplement their income, no questions asked. Joseph Nicelli, a funeral director from Brooklyn, became his primary accomplice. Together, they established a system that operated with chilling efficiency. When a body arrived at one of their partner funeral homes, Mastromarino and his team would swoop in before the family's viewing. Working in back rooms, they would extract whatever tissues could be sold, from long bones like femurs to heart valves, skin, and tendons. The operation was brutal and hasty. There was no testing for disease, no concern for the donor's medical history, and certainly no respect for the dead. After harvesting what they wanted, they would cover their tracks by replacing bones with PVC pipes to maintain the body's shape for viewing. Incisions were hastily sewn up or covered with clothing, and the families never knew what had happened to their loved ones. To make their stolen tissues sellable, they created elaborate fictions. Mastromarino forged consent forms, altered medical histories, and changed the ages of donors to make them more appealing to tissue processors. Cancer patients became healthy donors. 80-year-olds became 50-year-olds on paper. HIV-positive donors were recorded as disease-free. The scope of the operation was staggering. For nearly 5 years, BTS harvested tissues from more than 1,000 bodies without consent, selling them to major tissue processing companies that, in turn, supplied hospitals nationwide. These tissues would be used in procedures ranging from dental implants to spinal surgeries, knee replacements to heart valve repairs. All while grieving families remained completely unaware that their loved ones had been desecrated for profit. And the profit was immense. A single corpse could yield tissues worth up to $250,000 on the transplant market. While Mastromarino was paying funeral directors a mere $1,000 per body, he was selling the harvested parts for tens of thousands. BTS was bringing in millions, all built on exploitation of the dead and deception of both families and the medical system meant to protect patients. The crimes. Of all the bodies violated by Mastromarino and his team, perhaps none better illustrates the depravity of their operation than the case of Alistair Cook. The beloved British broadcaster, known to millions as the host of Masterpiece Theatre and the radio program Letter from America, died in March 2004 at the age of 95. What his family didn't know was that Cook had been suffering from bone cancer that had metastasized throughout his body, a condition that would have immediately disqualified him as a tissue donor. Yet, within hours of his death, Mastromarino's team descended on his body at a New York funeral home. They harvested Cook's diseased bones and falsified his records, listing his age as 85 instead of 95 and claiming he died of a heart attack rather than cancer. These contaminated tissues were then processed and distributed for use in unsuspecting patients, including those undergoing dental implants and orthopedic procedures. The Cook case was not an isolated incident but rather emblematic of BTS's routine practices. In one particularly disturbing case, they took bones from a man who had died of systemic sepsis, a bloodstream infection that contaminated all his tissues. In another, they harvested tissues from a body that had been left unrefrigerated for days, long past the time when extraction would be considered safe. Their operating conditions were equally shocking. Rather than working in sterile environments as required by medical standards, Mastromarino and his team often conducted harvesting in the back rooms of funeral homes, using plumbing tools instead of surgical equipment, operating without proper refrigeration, and processing multiple bodies simultaneously without proper decontamination procedures. One former funeral home employee later testified that harvesting sometimes took place on the same tables where bodies were embalmed, with minimal cleanup between procedures. Others described seeing tissues placed in coolers normally used for beverages, transported without proper temperature control. The financial incentives driving these horrors were substantial. BTS would typically sell a single femur for $7,000, a pelvis for up to $9,000, and skin for several thousand more. While the company was paying funeral directors just $1,000 per body, Mastromarino was extracting tens of thousands in value from each corpse. By conservative estimates, Mastromarino's operation generated more than $4.7 million over its 5-year run. This was not simply a matter of cutting corners for profit. It was a systematic criminal enterprise built on deception, desecration, and disregard for human dignity. And all the while, families of the deceased remained completely unaware that their loved ones' bodies had been violated and exploited. They had no idea that what they believed were dignified funerals were, in fact, covers for a ghoulish harvest of human tissue. The unraveling. For years, Michael Mastromarino operated his grisly business with impunity. The perfect crime, it seemed, was one committed against those who could no longer speak for themselves. But in 2005, the first cracks in his operation began to appear. The beginning of the end came from an unexpected source. A detective in Brooklyn who was investigating a separate case involving funeral director Joseph Nicelli, Mastromarino's key accomplice. While looking into allegations of funeral home improprieties, the detective discovered financial records showing unusual payments from biomedical tissue services to Nicelli's funeral home, payments that couldn't be explained by normal business operations. Around the same time, a former funeral home employee came forward with disturbing claims. Having witnessed the harvesting operations firsthand, this whistleblower couldn't remain silent about the desecration occurring behind closed doors. Their testimony provided investigators with crucial insights into how the operation functioned. As suspicions mounted, the Food and Drug Administration began an investigation into BTS in late 2005. FDA officials were alarmed to discover significant discrepancies in donor documentation, consent forms with forged signatures, medical histories that had been clearly falsified, and records altered to make tissues more marketable. In October 2005, FDA investigators raided the offices of Biomedical Tissue Services in Fort Lee, New Jersey. What they found confirmed their worst fears: a trove of documents revealing the systematic fraud at the heart of Mastromarino's operation. Donor files were riddled with contradictions and obvious forgeries. Medical equipment was not up to code. The entire operation was designed to maximize profit with minimal regard for safety protocols. The implications were staggering. Tissues harvested by BTS had been distributed to processing companies and then to hospitals across the United States and internationally. Thousands of patients had received implants from potentially diseased or contaminated tissues. The public health risk was enormous. Within days of the raid, the FDA ordered a recall of all tissues processed by BTS, one of the largest recalls of human tissue in medical history. Major tissue processors scrambled to identify which products contained materials sourced from Mastromarino's company and to alert hospitals and doctors who had used them. For the families of those whose bodies had been violated, the revelations were devastating. Many learned through news reports that their loved ones might have been victims. Some who had held open casket funerals were left wondering how they hadn't noticed signs of the harvesting. The sense of violation and betrayal was profound. As investigators dug deeper into BTS's operations, the full scale of Mastromarino's crimes came into focus. What had begun as a response to isolated complaints had uncovered one of the most extensive and disturbing cases of body theft in American history. Legal proceedings. On February 23, 2006, Michael Mastromarino was arrested along with 3 accomplices. The charges were as numerous as they were disturbing: enterprise corruption, body stealing, opening graves, unlawful dissection, forgery, and criminal possession of stolen property. The indictment painted a picture of an organized criminal enterprise that had systematically violated the bodies of the dead and defrauded the medical system. Prosecutors described how Mastromarino and his team had harvested tissues from over 1,000 bodies without proper consent, falsified medical records, and sold potentially contaminated human tissue for implantation in unsuspecting patients. Initially, Mastromarino maintained his innocence. His defense team argued that he believed the funeral directors had obtained proper consent from families. They claimed he was merely providing a valuable service to the medical community by increasing the supply of needed tissues for transplant procedures. But as the evidence mounted and former associates began to cooperate with prosecutors, Mastromarino's position became untenable. In March 2008, he pleaded guilty to numerous charges including enterprise corruption, reckless endangerment, and body stealing. During his plea hearing, Mastromarino finally admitted to the court what investigators had long known. He had directed a criminal enterprise that harvested tissue without consent, falsified records, and knowingly sold tissues that failed to meet medical standards. The sentencing hearing in June 2008 was emotional and tense. Family members of the deceased spoke about their anguish upon learning their loved ones had been violated. Some described how they had specifically declined organ donation only to discover their wishes had been ignored. Others expressed horror at the thought that diseased tissues from their family members might have been implanted in unwitting patients. When it was his turn to speak, Mastromarino offered a brief apology, claiming that his actions had been driven by addiction and desperation. But for most in the courtroom, these words rang hollow against the calculated nature of his crimes. Judge Albert Tomei sentenced Mastromarino to 15 to 30 years in state prison, one of the harshest sentences ever handed down for crimes involving human tissue. In his remarks, the judge emphasized the profound breach of trust that Mastromarino had committed as a former medical professional. His accomplices received lesser but still significant sentences. Joseph Nicelli, the funeral director who had been his primary partner, was sentenced to 8 to 25 years. 2 other assistants received sentences of 3 to 9 years for their roles in the operation. Beyond the criminal proceedings, the case spawned hundreds of civil lawsuits. Families sued Mastromarino, the funeral homes, and even the tissue processing companies that had purchased and distributed the illegally harvested materials. Many of these suits would continue for years after the criminal case concluded, as families sought compensation for their emotional suffering. The tissue processors themselves, while not criminally charged, faced their own legal and financial consequences. Several major companies were forced to pay millions in settlements to patients who had received tissues sourced from BTS, and their reputations suffered significant damage. The aftermath. The Mastromarino case sent shockwaves through multiple industries and left lasting trauma for thousands of people connected to his crimes. For the families of the deceased, the emotional impact was devastating. Many described feeling as though their loved ones had been violated twice, once in death and again in the discovery of what had happened. Some families had to live with the knowledge that they had held open casket viewings, unaware that beneath the clothing and makeup, their loved ones' bodies had been hollowed out and filled with PVC pipes. Support groups formed as families sought to process their grief and anger. Many spoke of nightmares, anxiety, and a profound sense of guilt at having failed to protect their deceased relatives. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the initial shock, becoming a wound that would never fully heal for some. For patients who received tissues processed by BTS, the aftermath was a different kind of nightmare. Thousands were notified that they had received implants that might be contaminated with disease. Many had to undergo testing for HIV, hepatitis, and other conditions that could have been transmitted through improperly screened tissues. Some patients chose to have their implants removed, facing additional surgeries and recoveries. Others lived with the anxiety of not knowing whether their implants might someday cause health problems. The psychological toll on these unsuspecting recipients was immense. They had sought medical help only to become victims of Mastromarino's scheme. The funeral industry faced a crisis of trust. New regulations were implemented requiring more stringent documentation and oversight of tissue donation. Funeral directors across the country found themselves having to reassure grieving families that their practices were ethical and transparent. Many funeral homes now provide detailed information about tissue donation processes and maintain rigorous records of all bodies in their care. Industry associations developed new ethical guidelines and training programs to help prevent similar abuses. The tissue banking industry underwent similarly dramatic changes. The FDA implemented more rigorous inspection protocols for tissue recovery organizations. Tissue processors enhanced their verification procedures, implementing systems to better track the origins of all materials and verify the authenticity of consent documents. New regulations required more detailed documentation of donor medical histories and mandated more thorough testing. The entire chain of custody for human tissues, from recovery to processing to implantation, became subject to heightened scrutiny. Civil litigation continued for years after the criminal cases concluded. Hundreds of lawsuits were filed against Mastromarino's estate, the funeral homes involved, and the tissue processing companies. These suits resulted in settlements totaling tens of millions of dollars, though many families maintained that no financial compensation could address the violation they had experienced. Perhaps the most profound impact was less tangible: a heightened awareness of the vulnerabilities in our systems for caring for the dead. The case forced a societal reckoning with questions about dignity after death and the commodification of human remains. It revealed how easily trust could be betrayed when oversight was inadequate and profit motives were allowed to override ethical considerations. Mastromarino's final years. Behind the walls of New York's Wenda Correctional Facility, Michael Mastromarino began serving his 15 to 30-year sentence in 2008. The former oral surgeon, once accustomed to luxury and prestige, now lived in a 6 by 9 foot cell, inmate number 08A1137. Fellow inmates were well aware of his crimes. The nature of his offenses, desecrating the dead, made him a pariah even among murderers and violent criminals. Prison officials kept him isolated from the general population for his own safety. In a twist of fate that many viewed as karmic justice, Mastromarino was diagnosed with metastatic bone cancer in 2012, just 4 years into his sentence. The disease attacked the very bones he had harvested from others, including from those who had died from the same disease. His health deteriorated rapidly. The man who had once stolen body parts from cancer patients now found himself consumed by the same disease. Pain that couldn't be adequately controlled with medication became his constant companion. In his final months, Mastromarino reportedly expressed remorse for his crimes. Through his attorney, he attempted to reach out to some of the victims' families to apologize, though few were receptive. For most, his late contrition seemed hollow against the magnitude of his violations. On July 7, 2013, at the age of 49, Michael Mastromarino died at St. Luke's Hospital in New York. He had served just 5 years of his minimum sentence. His body was cremated, a final irony for a man who had made his fortune by exploiting the bodies of others. News of his death brought complex emotions for his victims' families. Some expressed relief that the chapter was finally closed. Others felt robbed of the justice they had sought, believing his death had allowed him to escape the full measure of his punishment. The doctor who had harvested organs was gone, but the wounds he inflicted, on families, on patients, and on the public's trust, would continue to fester long after his passing. Conclusion. The case of Michael Mastromarino stands as one of the most disturbing examples of medical betrayal in modern history. It forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems we trust, both in life and in death. Thank you for watching this video, and if you found this video informative, please consider subscribing to our channel for more explorations of medical crimes and ethical breaches in healthcare.